What you are about to hear might completely change everything you thought you knew about the direction of WWE's most dangerous faction, and if you are not caught up, you are already behind. Welcome to FameWire, the channel that breaks down professional wrestling's biggest stories with the depth and detail they deserve. If this is your first time here, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because what we are covering today is the kind of storyline that only comes around a handful of times in a generation, and you are going to want to be here for every single development as it unfolds. Now let us set the scene properly, because context is everything when it comes to understanding just how significant the events of this past week truly are. For a considerable stretch of time now, Seth Rollins has been engaged in what can only be described as a deeply personal and increasingly dangerous one-man campaign against the Vision, the very faction that he played a central role in bringing into existence before being brutally cast aside. This is not simply a rivalry born out of competition or ego. This is something far more primal and far more consuming. Rollins was betrayed by something he helped build, and that kind of wound does not heal quietly. It festers, it intensifies, and eventually it explodes outward with a force that no restraining order or legal threat or carefully constructed manipulation can contain. His strategy throughout this conflict has been deliberate and methodical in a way that reflects everything we know about the character of Seth Rollins at his most dangerous. He has not gone after the Vision's rank and file members in an attempt to dismantle the faction from the outside. Instead, he has gone straight for the heart of the operation, targeting the architects of its power and the individuals whose removal would cause the greatest structural damage. Chief among those targets has been Paul Heyman, the oracle, the strategist, the man whose mind is arguably the most valuable asset the Vision possesses. Rollins understands, perhaps better than anyone, that factions of this kind do not survive the loss of their intellectual foundation, and so it is Heyman he has been hunting with the most focused and unrelenting intensity. The events of March the 2nd served as a visceral and genuinely shocking demonstration of just how far Rollins was prepared to go in this pursuit. What unfolded that night was not a planned segment or a carefully choreographed moment of storytelling. It felt raw and real and utterly uncontrolled. Rollins emerged from within a crowd of masked decoys, a tactical move designed to confuse and disorient anyone who might have been positioned to protect Heyman, and before anyone could react, he drove the Oracle's head into the mat with a stomp of devastating and calculated brutality. The consequences were severe and immediate. Heyman sustained lacerations, a cervical spine contusion, and a deviated septum, injuries serious enough to remove him from television for an extended and indefinite period of time. The message had been delivered with absolute clarity. Seth Rollins was not playing. But this week, the dynamic shifted in a way that nobody could have fully anticipated, and it is this shift that makes what is happening right now so genuinely compelling to analyze and discuss. The Hunter, as he had been operating so effectively for weeks, suddenly found himself in the uncomfortable and unfamiliar position of being the one who was hunted. The circumstances that made this possible are worth examining in detail, because they reveal just how many moving parts are at play in this increasingly complex narrative. Following his earlier assault on Heyman, Rollins had faced the prospect of serious legal consequences that could have kept him away from the action entirely. But when Adam Pearce, the general manager of Raw, made the announcement that all charges had been dropped and that Rollins had been medically cleared to compete and to appear, the atmosphere inside Madison Square Garden changed instantly and dramatically. There was an electricity in that building that you could feel through the screen, the kind of anticipatory tension that only genuine unpredictability can generate. And Rollins, true to his character, wasted absolutely no time in making his presence and his intentions known. Heyman, for his part, had spent the intervening period doing what he does better than virtually anyone in the history of the business. He had been working every angle available to him, pursuing restraining orders through legal channels, deploying his considerable verbal talents to get inside Rollins' head with pointed and deeply personal references to his family, and attempting wherever possible to maneuver Rollins into a position where the next act of aggression would bring legal consequences severe enough to remove him from the equation permanently. It was a masterclass in manipulation from a man who has made manipulation into an art form, but none of it was enough. None of it could account for the moment when Rollins appeared behind him in that ring at Madison Square Garden, steel chair in hand, while Heyman stood there with a microphone celebrating the Vision's latest Tag Team Championship triumph, blissfully unaware of what was coming. The chair connected across Heyman's back with a crack that silenced every other sound in the building for a fraction of a second before the crowd absolutely erupted. It was the kind of moment that reminds you why live wrestling, when it is working at its absolute best, is unlike anything else in entertainment. Rollins then took the time to position Heyman's head against the chair with a cold and terrifying precision, setting up the exact same stomp that had sent the Oracle to the hospital weeks earlier. Heyman's expression in that moment, a mask of pure and helpless terror worn by a man who has spent decades being the smartest person in every room he has ever entered, told the entire story without a single word being spoken. And then, just as Rollins lifted his foot to deliver what would surely have been a finishing blow, everything changed again. A hand of extraordinary size and force reached into the ring and dragged Rollins out before the stomp could land. When the camera found its focus and the audience processed what they were seeing, the identity of that individual sent a genuine shockwave through the entire wrestling community. It was Gunther, the ring general, the career killer. The man who has made a habit of ending the in-ring chapters of some of the most celebrated performers in the history of this industry, who had been conspicuously absent from television for a period of weeks, in circumstances that had fueled considerable speculation about where his character was heading creatively. What followed was not a confrontation or a standoff, it was a statement. Gunther locked in a rear-naked choke on the announce table and held it with the kind of unhurried and almost casual brutality that is the hallmark of everything he does, forcing Rollins to lose consciousness in one of the most visually arresting and symbolically loaded moments WWE has produced in some time. And as Rollins faded, Gunther directed his gaze deliberately and unmistakably at the WrestleMania sign hanging above the arena. There was nothing ambiguous about what that gesture meant. The Vision now had an enforcer of the highest possible order, and the balance of power in this entire conflict had been fundamentally and perhaps permanently altered. To fully appreciate the significance of Gunther's involvement, it is important to understand the broader context in which this development has taken place, because nothing here happened in isolation, and the layers beneath the surface are where the most interesting elements of this story reside. According to reports that had been circulating within wrestling media for some time, Gunther had originally been scheduled to feature in a high-profile match against Rey Mysterio at WrestleMania. It was a program that made considerable sense on paper, pairing one of the company's most beloved and experienced performers against the dominant and physically imposing champion, whose style represented everything Mysterio's does not. But when Mysterio was forced out of action by injury, those plans collapsed, leaving Gunther without a clear and defined direction heading into the most important event of the wrestling calendar. Simultaneously, the Vision was dealing with its own problems in the personnel department. Bron Breakker, the powerhouse who had been one of the faction's most physically imposing assets, and who Rollins had originally identified as a primary target in his war against the group, had been sidelined following hernia surgery. His absence created a void in the Vision's structure, a gap that Heyman and the rest of the faction's leadership would have been acutely aware needed to be addressed if they were going to continue operating from a position of strength. The timing of Gunther's intervention begins to look rather less like coincidence when you examine those circumstances side by side. But the question that has the wrestling world genuinely buzzing right now, the question that transforms this from an interesting storyline development into something with potentially historic implications, is a much bigger and more explosive one than simply explaining why Gunther stepped in to save Paul Heyman in that moment. The question is what Gunther expects to receive in return. Because a man of Gunther's stature and reputation, a performer who has built his entire identity around the principle that alliances are transactional and that every action carries a price, does not intervene in someone else's war without having a very clear and very specific objective of his own in mind. The theory that is generating the most excitement and the most discussion among those who follow this industry most closely points in a direction that, if it proves to be accurate, would make everything we have witnessed so far look like merely the opening chapter of something genuinely extraordinary. The suggestion being made by sources with knowledge of the creative direction is that Gunther did not save Paul Heyman simply because he has any particular loyalty to the vision or its members.